Welcome to our 7th lesson in the book of Job, and this is in some ways the lesson that we've all been waiting for, the lesson that Job has been waiting for, because finally now we're going to hear from God. Job has been begging and pleading and demanding that he hear from God. We have heard for 35 chapters Job's questions and Job's friends' answers and ideas, and Elihu, whom we met last week, his answers and his ideas. But today we hear from God. Now, we sometimes say things like, now when I get to heaven, I've got questions I'm going to ask God, and God, had better answer me. I want to know why this happened, or why God did it this way, or whatever. Job, in a sense, doesn't have that option. The Old Testament didn't have a fully developed concept of heaven, and Job's story is so ancient, there certainly wasn't a concept of heaven. So if he didn't get it in this life, it wasn't going to be enough. But there's also the sense in which I think for all of us, when we're suffering, only looking forward to heaven, even that isn't enough. We really want answers in the here and the now, and yet we may discover, as Job did, that those answers may not be exactly what we were expecting or what we wanted. And so let me share with you, our lesson today is Job, the 38th chapter, the first 11 verses. But God actually speaks for 3 chapters here. I invite you to read all of them, and I'll actually be sharing with you some of them as well during the lesson. But those first few verses, the 38th chapter begins, and now finally God answered Job from the eye of a violent storm. He said, "Why do you confuse the issue? Why do you talk without knowing what you're talking about? Pull yourself together, Job. Up on your feet. Stand tall. I have some questions for you, and I want some straight answers. Where were you when I created the earth? Tell me, since you know so much. Who decided on its size? Certainly you'll know that. Who came up with the blueprints and measurements? How was its foundation poured, and who set the cornerstone? While the morning stars sang in chorus, and all the angels shouted praise. And who took charge of the ocean when it gushed forth like a baby from the womb? That was me. I wrapped it in soft clouds and tucked it in safely at night. Then I made a playpen for it, a strong playpen, so it couldn't run loose. And I said, stay here. This is your place. Your wild tantrums are confined to this place." And I was reading there from the Message translation. I like the way that Eugene Peterson translates that poetry into language that maybe we can understand a little bit better. You may remember last week, maybe it feels like last year, we talked about Elihu, Job's maybe friend, a bystander, young man who was kind of listening in and kind of interjected himself. And I mentioned that some of Elihu's speech sounds like God's. Just let me share you a little bit of that. In chapter 36, Elihu says, "Take a long, hard look. See how great God is? Infinite, greater than anything you could ever imagine or figure out. He pulls water up out of the sea, distills it, and fills up his rain cloud cisterns. Then the skies open up and pour out soaking showers on everyone. Does anyone have the slightest idea how this happens? How he arranges the clouds, how he speaks in thunder." And that sounds a lot like the passage I just read. It sounds even more like chapter 38, or a little later in the 38th chapter, when God says of Job, and again, compare this to what Elihu just said, "Can you find your way to where lightning is launched, or to the place from where the wind blows? Who do you suppose carves canyons for the downpours of rain, and charts the route of thunderstorms, that bring water to unvisited fields, deserts no one ever lays eyes on, drenching the useless wastelands so they're carpeted with wild flowers and grass? And who do you think is the father of rain and dew, the mother of ice and frost? You don't for a minute imagine these marvels of weather just happen, do you?" And so again, we have this idea of God as being infinite and wonderful, and yet there's a contrast, perhaps, between Elihu and his words and God's. What is the difference? And I think the difference is that for Elihu, God is the object. God is an object to be studied. And Elihu actually thinks that he has God all figured out. And he's using the words, the mystery of God and the power of God, but he really is trying to use those as ways of just saying, I've got God all figured out. But for God, when he is speaking to Job, he isn't the object, of course. God is the subject. God is there, present. And so God is not an object to be studied, but rather is the subject with whom to have a relationship. And that is the difference, really, between the 37th and the several chapters, 5 chapters before that, and the 38th, 39th, and 40th chapters where God is speaking. God is one with whom we can be in a relationship. I heard an interview last week with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and he said in that interview that he didn't grow up in church. He was not a Christian. I can't remember if he was in college or he had just graduated from college, but he was in Nairobi doing some kind of government work there, some kind of relief work, but it wasn't a Christian ministry. It was secular relief work. And he said he'd always seen Christianity as basically irrelevant. And the idea, the notion of a concept of God, maybe there's a God, maybe there's not a God, it really didn't matter to him and his life. He wasn't really hot about it one way or the other. And then he goes to Nairobi and he says, there I met Christians for whom God was a reality and not a concept. For them, God was whom you followed rather than that what you believed in. Think about that for a minute and think about the book of Job. For the first 37 chapters of Job, God is just a concept. Just something either to believe in or not believe in, something to be able to study and figure out, maybe even something to be manipulated to get what you want. And then in the 38th chapter, everything changes and God becomes now someone to follow rather than someone to believe in, simply to believe in. God becomes a reality, not just a concept. Job encounters God in this violent storm, and God speaks to Job, though, directly out of the storm. Now, Elihu talks about storm and lightning and experiencing God in those things, but he is experiencing God in kind of a second-hand way. He finds evidence for God in those things, and that's fine and wonderful, and I suspect we all do. It's hard for me to see a beautiful sunset and not see evidence of God, but I have never heard God speak to me out of the sunset, or I love sitting on my porch when a rainstorm is coming in, and I just feel the presence of God in many ways when the rainstorm comes in, but I haven't directly heard God speak to me out of the storm. But God doesn't simply hear the wind or see the sun or whatever as evidences of God, but Job directly experiences God, the voice of God, the presence of God in that storm. And that's important, and that's a distinction, I think. Now, I do think that we need to recognize there's at least a couple different ways to read the way that God responds to Job. And rather than choosing one, I think we want to try to hang on to both of them and recognize that if we don't try to hang on to both of them, we're going to miss something very important, even though in a sense they may feel like they're almost contradictory. And the first is that God is kind of pulling rank on Job here. I mentioned to the Sunday school class last week that James Weldon Johnson wrote a poem, and I thought it was about Job, and I went back and reread it, and it wasn't. It actually was about the prodigal son. And the prodigal son's father says to him, young man, your arm's too short to box with God." And there's a sense in which, though, that's exactly what God is saying to Job. He says, stand up and gird your loins, is the way the King James and even the New RSV says. Eugene Peterson just says, stand up like a man and answer me. But God is basically saying, young man, your arms are really too short to box with me. In chapter 40, God actually asks, and almost asks this question, or says this. He says, do you presume to tell me what I'm doing wrong? Are you calling me, God, a sinner so you can be a saint? Do you have an arm like my arm? Can you shout in thunder the way I can? Go ahead, show your stuff. Let's see what you're made of. Let's see what you can do. And so God is in some ways pulling rank on Job. You're not powerful enough to ask me questions. How dare you even presume to ask me questions in the one hand? And yet God never, ever criticizes Job for asking questions. He criticizes Job for presuming to know the answers, perhaps, but he never criticizes Job for asking questions. And that's important because I want us to know we can ask God our questions. We can pour out our hearts to God. Just as we said several weeks ago, Jesus on the cross cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And as if Jesus could feel forsaken from the cross and ask that question, we also can feel forsaken, and we may need to ask that question of God as well. But of course, Jesus ends up that time on the cross by saying, into your hands I commit my spirit. I recognize that you are greater than me. I recognize that I must commit myself to you, and we need to do the same. And I think that is what Job is learning here. And so I think it's pretty crucial for us to recognize that God's ways are not our ways. We cannot fully understand God or God's ways, and we never will. And anybody who tells you that they know exactly what God is up to, particularly if they're telling you about what God's up to in your life, be a little suspicious, because they may not, and probably they don't. There's an old proverb, but not one in the Bible, but I think it's accurate nevertheless, that says, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And it's not because God will frustrate our plans just to have a good laugh at our expense, but rather I can make all kinds of plans, but I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, much less what's going to happen in the next year or so. And so if you want to make God laugh, tell him all of your well thought out plans, everything you're going to do, and see how that all works out. The point is, we are not God. The James Webb Telescope is sending us some just stunning pictures. I don't know if you've seen those lately. Just today, I saw a picture of Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, in a way that I've never seen it before, and it's because this telescope is just so stunning. And yet the best we can do is take pictures of Jupiter. We didn't hang Jupiter in its orbit. We don't fully understand everything about it. I can't conceive of how big Jupiter is. It's so many hundreds of times larger than the Earth, and yet God hung Jupiter in its orbit. God controls Jupiter in a way that we never will be able to. Later in the 40th chapter, God mentions Behemoth and Leviathan, and I thought we'd spend just a moment or two on them. Behemoth is this giant land creature, and probably it is meant to be a poetic, almost compilation of lots of creatures, and this gigantic, terrifying land creature that for God is simply a part of creation. But some people think that maybe what is being described here is a hippopotamus, and if so, that's pretty good too, because hippopotami can be incredibly ferocious beasts. You may know that hippopotami kill more people than any other land creature in Africa. We would think it might be a lion or something, or even an elephant maybe, but it's the hippopotamus. And the reason is that they are just so fiercely defensive of their territory, and they are largely in the water, and you may not even know they're there because they stay submerged so much. And then you get in their way, either in a boat or by being out in the water, and they react incredibly violently towards people or towards anything that might intrude upon them. And even if they're on the land, they look like these big ungainly creatures. They can run 30 miles an hour, and so if one is chasing any of us, it will be able to catch us if it wants to. And so we can't control this 4,000 pound beast, whether it is a fictitious beast or whether it's a hippopotamus. And yet for God, it's just part of creation. And then Leviathan is kind of the corresponding sea creature. And I would encourage you to read the descriptions of Leviathan. Again, the Message does a great job of it. Almost sounds like a dragon in the Message version. This gigantic, ferocious beast is said to be, and it says so in Job, that Leviathan is king of the ocean and king of the deep. Not us. We out in our little boats. Leviathan is the king of the ocean and can take any boat down it chooses. And yet Leviathan is just part of God's creation, just small potatoes to the God that hung Jupiter and hung our entire solar system, and indeed the entire universe. And so that's important for us to recognize, that we are not God. I saw a story recently of a man who decided he wanted to become a doctor, but he didn't want to go to medical school and go through internships and all of the stuff that you need to do to become a doctor. He decided he could learn everything he needed to learn from YouTube. And now there's a lot of things to learn from YouTube, and some of you are watching this lesson on YouTube, but learning to be a doctor is probably not the best, an education to be a doctor from YouTube is probably not your best bet. But this man did not simply want to be any old garden variety doctor. He wanted to become a heart surgeon. And so he began watching videos about the heart. And apparently there are heart surgery videos you can see. I don't think they're how-to videos, but heart surgery videos. And he began watching them. And then he began recruiting patients. And sometimes they'd be patients that he knew couldn't afford to go to a real doctor. And he would offer to care for them for a much reduced rate, $60 or something, or even for barter for something that he wanted or whatever. And he started small. He would try to surgically remove cysts from people's bodies and this kind of thing. But he was working himself up to heart surgery, and that's what he wanted. When he was caught and arrested and convicted for practicing medicine without a license and endangering human life, and he had multiple counts against him. Well, hopefully none of us would be foolish enough to go to a heart surgeon who had learned his craft from YouTube and had never ever actually practiced heart surgery anyway. It's also the case that this young man, or I don't know if he's a young man, but this man was practicing in this trailer that he owned that apparently was just filthy, and there was blood all over the floor from previous patients that he had, and it was just a filthy thing. If you had heart surgery from him, you were not likely going to survive. We wouldn't do that, and hopefully we would also be smart enough not to try ourselves to treat our own hearts or to treat a loved one's heart from something that we learned from YouTube. And that's kind of what God is saying to Job here. Job, you think that you can just make me an object and study me, and then you can tell me how to run things, and you know better than I do how to run things, but you don't. And there's no way you can have the wisdom and the experience that I have, much the way that I can't have the wisdom and the experience and the education that a heart surgeon has, and I just can't expect to. If I need heart surgery, I'm going to have to just place myself at their mercy and trust them that they can do it, but I can't do it for myself. That's what God is telling Job, and I think that's what God tells us as well. And so although God does come across rather brusquely, maybe that's important, because you need to know you can't be a heart surgeon, and I need to know I can't be a heart surgeon until I've done what I need to do to be able to do those things, and I'll never be able to be God, and I just need to understand that, and I may need to have it told to me in a way that can get through my thick skull. But there's a second thing going on here, and it's that God isn't only pulling rank. Now, it may not sound completely like it, but God really is coming to Job in love. And why do we know that God is coming to Job in love? Because God came to Job. There's an old story. It's probably a legend that a man found himself broken down on the side of the road, and he was convinced that his car was just useless, that it was never going to run again. It was not repairable. And a stranger stops and walks up and says, can I help you? And the man said, I don't think so. I think my car's shot. I have no more hope. And the man said, well, would you mind if I gave it a try? And the guy says, well, you sure can't hurt anything. You can't make it any worse. And so the guy fiddles under the hood for a little bit, and then they try it, and sure enough, it just roars right to life. And the guy goes, I'd given up all hope. How was it that you knew how to fix my car? And the man said, well, my name is Henry Ford, and I invented that car. I built that car. I know how that car operates. And there's a sense in which God is coming to Job to say, you're not going to be able to understand what has happened to you. You're not going to ever be able to fully make sense of your life. But here's the deal. I invented you. I built you. I know how you work. I love you, and I am with you now in relationship, in spite of the fact that I run the entire universe. And it's kind of interesting. Job is not a book of science, and we're not to learn science from it, but Job understands just how vast the universe is, and yet the God of the universe cares enough to come to be with Job. Now, Job is never going to learn why he suffered so much, and we may not learn those lessons either, but here is what we can know. That God loves us, and God cares for us, and God cares enough even to show up for us. We know that wonderful old hymn that comes from Jesus, a parable, his eyes on the sparrow, and so I know that it's also on me. Nothing is too small in the universe to escape God's notice or care, and there's nothing too great in the universe to escape God's power or God's ability to have some control over. I want to go quickly back to Leviathan just for a moment, because Leviathan is in part an example of God's power, but also Leviathan can be an example of God's love as well. In the 104th Psalm, it says that God created Leviathan in order to sport with it in the ocean. And many of the ancient rabbis, when they were studying this passage, came up with this beautiful, beautiful idea that every single day, God takes about a half an hour or an hour out of the incredibly busy time that God has in running the universe, simply to sport with Leviathan, to play with Leviathan, this fearsome sea creature that blows out fire and smoke and all of the stuff that we are told in Job Leviathan can do. This thing that if any of us encountered, we might just fall over dead. We'd be so afraid of it. God just plays with it the way that we might play with a puppy or play with a kitten. God created Leviathan simply to sport in it. God loves Leviathan, and God loves you, and God loves me. And so to end this lesson, I want to return again to Archbishop Welby. And in that interview that I heard from him, he said that more than 30 years ago, he and his wife had a son. And their son only lived about 7 months, and then he died. And that, of course, was a terrible, terrible time for, I don't think he was Archbishop then, but for probably maybe Reverend at the time, Welby. And it was a terribly difficult time for them, and yet he said that he experienced God's presence in a powerful way during that time. He just sensed God walking with him through the grief. God didn't take the grief away. God didn't restore his son to him or anything like that. But nevertheless, he experienced God's love and God's care. And what a wonderful thing that was. And then some years later, their daughter developed a very serious illness. And during that time, Reverend Welby said that he did not experience God's presence. God just seemed absent. And yet, he said, it was during that time that the community of faith just surrounded my wife and me. And they basically just carried us during that time, the two of us and, of course, our daughter. And I gather that the daughter eventually recovered, but carried them through that time. And he said how wonderful it is that sometimes we get to experience God's presence in a very personal way where God is just obviously present with us. And other times when for whatever reason we are unable to experience God's presence, we still have the family of faith for us. And that takes me back to Job's friends and reminds me that Job's friends did what they could, and that, as we will see in the upcoming lesson, Job is going to pray for his friends. Job cares for his friends. Even though they didn't do everything right, he does care for them. And that we are called sometimes not to be God for other people, because we can't be God, and not maybe to try to make sense for other people, to come up with some pat answer to give them, to explain to them why God is doing something to them or why whatever is happening for them. But we are called to reach out to them in compassion and in love, and that may be the way that they experience the presence of God. And we can do that, of course, because God is with us. Amen.